All right, we are set.
Okay.
I also entered the link to the handout in the chat if you want to make sure to repeat that.
Great. And I put some links in the chat here to everyone that you can refer to later. And that is, I wanted to remind everybody about the Thursday office hours, and also to please go ahead and take the feedback survey that Melissa had shared with everybody last week, so that we can kind of make sure that we can maximize the effectiveness of these workshops for the rest of them. So I dropped the links in the chat. One is the Survey Monkey, that is for the survey, and the other is language access coaching sessions.as.me. Let me know if you're not able to see those. And
Mary Jane, this is Karen. I see, I see the coaching one, but not the other one. And I see Anthony's Google Drive too.
Here, let me see here.
I don't know if you want to redrop them in there.
Sure, I'm not able to copy and post them right now, so I will go ahead and do that. Or Anthony, would you mind, the Survey Monkey and the language access sessions, would you mind sharing those in the chat while I get started? I'm not able to copy and paste, so thanks for letting me know that you're not able to see it though, Karen. So just to get started, because we have a lot to cover today, this session is going to be the first in a series of 2 workshops, kind of like we split up the interpreter ethics and best practices into 2 workshops. We're going to split up language access planning into 2 workshops that are going to talk about, strategies that you can apply across government, nonprofit, private sector, all kinds of different organizations. And the goal would be for participants to learn strategies for assessing their current policies and procedures, the needs of communities, defining the scope of services, and providing public notice. So we're going to focus on those today. And basically, we're just going to go ahead and introduce you all to the wonderful world of language access planning. Some of you might already have language access plans in place, or already be familiar with what a language access plan is. And if that's the case, this session could just be a review for you. And I hope that there is still some useful information in there for you. But if you do have experience with this stuff already, I would love your input in the discussion.
That would be appropriate.
Since your experiences will be valuable for all the other participants who don't have prior experience. And for all of you, as always, please don't hesitate to ask questions, share your own work and experiences, or just get involved in general. And thank you, as always, for being here. Since hours and hours could potentially be spent on this subject, I'm breaking it down into these 2 workshops this week and next week. And today we're going to talk about, what is a language access plan? What are its essential parts? Assessing needs, defining the scope of the services you're going to provide, and also how are you going to let your, constituents, customers, patients, your consumers know that you are making these services available for them. So quick question for you guys. How many of you are part of organizations that already have language access plans in place? Anybody?
We have a draft. This is Valerie from Atlanta. Hi, everyone. We have a draft, but it hasn't been implemented yet. Well, no, we have a draft that is in implement. It hasn't been launched yet. Sorry.
Well, that's fantastic. All right, well, I love that there is such a spectrum of experience within this group, and I really encourage you guys to all support each other, both during these calls or workshops and after. Stay in touch with each other, share tips. There's so much information out there available about language access plans. Some of it's great, some of it's not so great. But really, I think that drawing on the experience of our peers is one of the best ways to get something that's robust and original and creative to really help get information out to English learning constituents. So oops, what is a language access plan, right? I think everybody has a basic idea of what a language access plan is, but for those of you who don't have any prior experience with language access planning, we'll just start with a simple definition. And that's basically a language access plan is a document that spells out how to provide services for English learning individuals. Language access plans are to be made and tailored to individual organizations, but they all share a lot in common, such as the three components that we're going to talk about today. Needs assessment, definition of the services your organization will be providing and to whom, and a strategy for informing those individuals with notifications of the services that are going to be available to them, as well as their rights to those services. So basically, any organization serving English learners should develop a language access plan. This includes, but not limited to, any organizations that receive any degree of federal fundings, such as hospitals, health plans, community-based organizations, etc. Any organizations that are accredited by entities such as like the Joint Commission or the National Committee for Quality Assurance, government entities, public schools, universities, etc. You'd be surprised how much federal funding there is in almost any grant. You know, if you accept medical assistance as a private practice, so pretty much anybody who's providing services to the public, apart from like, you know, private tutors and, you know, things like that, are pretty much required to provide language services under the law. And the 4-factor analysis method is often used as a planning tool that's kind of placed one and another right next to each other with language access planning. And that's this square that you see on the left side of your screen. And it basically determines the extent of it helps your organization determine the extent that persons who are English learners will come into contact with your programs and services, and how you can best provide language services to ensure meaningful access, right? It kind of roots the language access planning process into these 4 factors that you see. They're defined by lep.gov and pretty much widely accepted in the community and in language access planning circles that 1 is the number or proportion of English learners eligible to be served or likely to be encountered by the program or grantee. 2, the frequency with which LEP or English learning individuals come into contact with the program. 3, the nature and importance of the program, activity, or service provided by the program to people's lives. And 4, the resources that are available to the recipient and costs. So the intent of this guidance is to sort of suggest a balance that ensures meaningful access to for English learners, that they will be able to access critical services while not, accruing on the organizational side undue burdens for small local governments, for small nonprofits, et cetera. So basically what it's saying is that you're balancing the need against the resources that you have available. And the 4-factor analysis will help you make decisions about that. And then over on the right are just these parts of the language access plan, the 3 of which we're going to cover today, and the rest we're going to cover next Monday. There are lots of other common components of a language access plan, and the ones that we're going to discuss next week are going to be identifying your service providers, volunteers, bilingual staff, any kind of human resources that you have available to help. And that's, based on this idea that it's really important to have trusted language service providers for in-person interpretation, over-the-phone interpretation, video remote interpretation, and written translation. Those might not be the same service provider, so having contracts in place with one, maybe a backup. We're going to talk about that next week. It's also really helpful to identify community volunteers and bilingual staff who can help, but only if they're trained, right? Like we talked about in those previous sessions. We're going to talk about staff roles and responsibility, right? So designating a language access coordinator, describing how your organization will train staff on its policies and procedures for providing language assistance services, And that includes who, how often, et cetera. I also think it's important to, delegate specific responsibilities to specific individuals as part of this process to ensure that there's some accountability and that this plan doesn't just get like shoved in a folder on a cloud drive somewhere and not ever implemented, right? The more skin people have in the game, the more likely a plan like this is to be successful. And finally, we're going to talk about evaluation, which is basically a plan for when and how your organization is going to monitor and update its language access plan, your policies, your procedures, everything to make sure that the needs are being met and that there's some kind of like a framework for like continuous quality control and accountability. So jumping right in, just to make sure that I don't go over time so that we all have a chance to talk and do Q&A later, we're going to talk about what it means to assess needs, right? And there are kind of two different angles for needs assessments. And really the first step in any plan, right, is going to be defining what your goal is, or in this case, to identify like the who, what, when, where, why of your English learners, the English learners in your region, and the needs both of your organization and of any like current or prospective consumers whose preferred spoken language is a language other than English, basically. So that means your organization's internal needs and resources, the needs of your communities, tracking the languages spoken in your region, geographical, demographic information, budgetary and resource concern, points of contacts, policy shortfalls, and about a bazillion other things. That 4-factor analysis tool was kind of designed to guide this process, and there's some basic information that you can pin down as part of any good language plan, and that includes like identifying the number of English learners and their linguistic and cultural groups within your service area, and their level of interaction with your programs and services. You're going to want to identify your points of contact, right? These are the points of contact that English learners have with your organization, how they're reaching you, how they're reaching out to you. Oh, excuse me. And what is your organization already doing or not doing, right? So this is kind of, identifying your sort of organization and what you're doing or not to address language accessibility on like a procedure and policy level. It's also a good tool for you to kind of figure out what you need to do to get your house in order before you start reaching out and start really trying to implement these plans. So, the first part of that, assessing the needs, is who are the English learners in your service area, right? Counting the number of individuals with limited English proficiency. And to understand the needs of any current or prospective English learning consumers, you have to start by, identifying those consumers and the English learners who your organization serves or is likely to encounter or serve in the future. Useful internal data sources might include like any call center information you have, any records that you've kept, information provided by social workers, navigators, advocates, electronic records. I dropped a link here, this cms.gov one on the top. That is the compendium for resources for standardized demographic and language data collection. This is a resource that provides information and resources around data collection, including race, language, and ethnicity. I think we all know that information about the numbers is really hard to get. Like, it's really hard to find accurate information, especially because we're 10 years out from the last census, and this year's rough in terms of being a census year. So if you do not have any internal data that you can collect and track and analyze, there are some publicly available resources that can kind of estimate the language, that you can use to estimate the language needs of the English learners that your organization is likely to encounter. The second link I dropped here is, of course, the Census Bureau's website that collects information about, non-English languages that are spoken in the US. And on the census website, you can follow this link to the American Community Survey, which is probably the most up-to-date official data source for this information on the top, non-English languages spoken in the US. And they present it at a national, state, and county level, which is pretty good. So these are just 2 resources. There are many, many out there. And because these numbers are so difficult to pin down, it's okay to also just use your own anecdotal experience to inform the data collection process, right? The American survey might not show, or the CMS data might not show that there is, for example, a large pocket of Nepali speaking refugees in the east end of your city, but your community better than the American survey. Your community, you interact with them, and that the need exists, right? So it's absolutely appropriate to mix the data with what you observe and what you know to be true within your communities. The next thing to think about once you identify who your English learners are, what the number are, is to talk about what their level of interaction is with your services, right? So in terms of the level at which English learners interact with your programs and services, you should identify and describe how English learners are interacting with your services. And this will kind of help you prioritize which language assistance services to offer. So some of the ways that English learners interact with your organization, for example, might include hotlines, information line calls, outreach programs, public meetings, listening sessions, or hearings, websites, digital resources, social media, written materials, complaint submission forms, brochures, and white pages or one-pagers that are intended for public distribution. So these are just a few examples, and by identifying your own, you're going to learn a lot about how to prioritize language assistance services depending on how the populations you have identified are actually interacting with those materials. So points of contact are another big important thing in terms of, assessing your needs and assessing what's happening with English learners with regard to how they interact with your agencies. English learners are going to need language services at different points of contact, right? Such as when they are trying to call a call center, or directly calling an office, or at a physical reception desk, filling out paperwork, documenting a grievance, navigating a building, paying a bill, and those are just a few examples, right? So pretty much any interaction with a service that you can anticipate needing communication for is kind of included in this. And your organization should really assess where individuals are interacting with your organization and figure out what kinds of language services would be appropriate for each point of contact. So here, I'm just going to give you a few examples of how language access services could be provided at a few common points of contact. One would be like a call center. So if you are calling, a hospital system to try to set up a dermatology appointment, or you're calling to dispute a charge on your phone bill or something like that, right? Where you call in and there's a phone tree. Your language access plan should include, a description of how your call center will identify an individual's language needs and how those needs will be met. Whether that's an automated system, right? Like, for English, press 1, for Spanish, press 2, that kind of thing, or advanced identification of the need for an interpreter, or information in languages other than English, right? And so what that means is if you have a system for, assessing whether or not an individual is going to need an interpreter, knowing that in advance and having somebody queued up to do over the phone interpretation. Another example is like a reception desk, or a waiting room, or a physical location. And your language access plan should include how your organization is going to provide language access services when, like, for example, a patient checks in for an appointment, or people who walk in from the street are seeking, directions or services or have questions, or if English learners need any other kind of information, like in a brick and mortar location. So providing signage could be a solution to that in your language access plan in the common languages spoken within your service area. And that might be able to help individuals navigate a reception area like that. Notices and taglines about the availability of interpreters can also be valuable, right? Like hanging up language identification charts in your physical locations. And those can kind of help address communication barriers at this point of contact to help ensure that English learners are able to communicate in these situations, right? So obviously, you know, a language ID chart or a sign in a reception area isn't going to solve your whole organization's language access problems. But when you get granular in a language access plan and you identify the points of contact, you can try to find solutions for all of these different examples. And that will overall help build your organization out as one that is accessible. Another common one is mailings or paperwork. English learners might also need language assistance to read or complete paperwork, like signing in for things, applying for insurance, reading educational information, signing, you know, benefits paperwork or discharge information from a hospital. And so your language access plan should sort of specify what types of documents will be available in language other than English, the languages in which such documents will be provided, and your process to ensure the accuracy of those translations. I'm a very big proponent of identifying your vital documents, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit here. So, you know, kind of deciding in advance that you're going to have certain documents translated and ready to go is a way to solve the problem at your point of contact in a proactive way rather than a reactive kind of situation that most of us find ourselves in, you know, in most of the time. So, you know, the next thing you want to look at, apart from, you know, what the needs are of your community, what the points of contact are, is you want to talk about your organization's needs. Looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of your own organization's language access policies and procedures is a huge part of the needs assessment process. I think a lot of language access planning tools that you'll find out there focus a lot on identifying, you know, the populations, the demographics, the needs externally, but very few focus within to see, you know, what are you already doing? What can you do better? And I think it's also an important step in putting together an evaluation plan, which is something we're going to talk about next week. But, you know, identifying all of the different things that are on the handout that Melissa shared with you this morning, and working with that framework to make sure you're doing everything that you can do, but also to give you a point of reference for future evaluation is really important. So I've provided you all with that worksheet, and that's just a basic start. It's only one tool to help you begin to think about some of these things. I adapted that one personally from the federal LEP.gov document called Language Access Assessment and Planning Tool for Federally Conducted and Federally Assisted Programs. That worksheet, the full one, is available at the LEP.gov website. And I kind of just like cleaned it up a little bit and took out some of the stuff I didn't think was important and created that one. But there are several needs assessment forms out there. And all of these questions, you know, they might not apply to each of you, but they're a great place to start thinking about how you will set up and evaluate your organization's capabilities and later how you'll measure your performance. So if you guys wouldn't mind, just open up this document and briefly look over the questions. I'm going to give you just a couple minutes here. Hopefully you had a chance to look at it before we started, but if not, just crack it open and kind of go through the pages and, you know, can you already spot gaps in your programming while you're looking at it? And if so, can anyone comment on that? Would anyone like to share, you know, something you think you do particularly well, or something based on just glancing at this you can already tell is something you're going to need to work on?
This is Valerie again. And at the City of Atlanta, as I was looking at it, I could tell that we had to work better at collecting data and tracking the language, the evolving languages. because we have also been, relying on Atlanta Public Schools information, the students' information, and then also pretty much, I think it's ACS and the Census Bureau. So these are changing, and I realized that one of the options you gave were community-based organizations and interactions they are having. We don't have anything in place to be able to collect that. So that's definitely one of the gaps I see.
Yeah, data collection is one of the, I think, real sticking points for people, because the data is so hard to come by, but also, especially across wide organizations, who's responsible for evaluating this data, right? And where does it live? And there's sort of infrastructural problems that go along with the data collection. So I think this is definitely one of the trickier problems associated with language access, for sure. So if anybody else wants to share one, I think there's great value in self-assessment. And, I always go back to this, it's not to say that you're doing something wrong, or that you're not doing enough, or that you're doing a poor job. It's just to say, how can we all learn to do this better together, and to have a resource and a framework, a place to start. And one of the great things about this program with Welcoming America is that, we're all getting to know each other through these workshops and through these calls. And I hope that you'll use each other as a resource, and that you'll use me as a resource, and that we can really use this to kind of put some of these ideas to life, and kind of build something together, right? And talk about our shared experiences and what's working and what's not working. So the next piece that I wanted to talk about today is defining your scope of services, right? And so what this basically means is that once you've identified who, right, what the language and cultural groups are, who the English learners are in your region, and then you've assessed your own needs as well as the needs of the communities that you serve, you're going to have to decide what kind of services you're able to commit to providing, right? So for example, your language access plan should outline the type of interpreters that you're going to use and their qualifications. A lot of the times organizations will use a combination of approaches and provide language access services through kind of a toolkit. So not just one sort of resource, but a combination of phone and video and in-person and written translation and liaison work. And that works for a lot of people. Some places need to have more direct, more rigorous types of interpreters and procedures and protocols, such as courts and legal systems and things like that. But you want your plan to include the details on the use of the different types of interpreters that you're going to use in different scenarios, for example. It's important to sort of tailor this approach based on both the need and the resources that you have available, because you want your plan to be realistic in terms of what you're able to do. You're also going to have to define the types and qualifications of the interpreters that you plan to use, right? So for oral, phone, liaison, video interpretation, are they, dedicated staff interpreters? I know a lot of school districts have paraprofessionals who are interpreters that, do a lot of the phone and video interpretation. Are they, freelancers? If so, how do you vet them? Are they qualified bilingual staff, right? That would be people who you've hired, who have language skills, who have agreed to use those language skills to help, and who have been trained. Are you using telephonic interpreters, video remote interpreters, all of the above? Using qualified interpreters matters, right? For the reasons that we discussed during that last two-part session about the best practices and ethical considerations of interpreters. But that being said, a lot of qualified interpreters aren't certified, and that's okay. And a lot of certified interpreters might not be qualified for certain assignments, right? Even if you're a legally certified interpreter, you might not be qualified to go into you know, a traumatic situation, for example, or to work with a victim of crime or assault. So it's important to understand that there aren't really any national standards for, I'm sorry, my daughter just walked in out right now. There aren't really any national standards for, you know, what constitutes a certified interpreter, but there are lots of different proprietary standards. You know, American Translation Association certification, state court interpreter certification, different proprietary organizations. So, you know, keep those in mind. Lots of states have different licensing and certification requirements. Qualifications and testing can vary, and you want to kind of define that in your plan. For written translation, it's really important to ensure that documents are translated accurately and effectively by professionals. Your plan should describe the materials that need to be translated and used in the languages that need to be used. So consider which documents are vital documents, which documents, you know, contain information that's critical for obtaining services or benefits. That's kind of that piece, the vital documents that I was telling you about before. Application forms, including those for benefits, consent forms, including consent to treat, release of information, consent to immunize, complaint forms, eligibility forms, financial payment policies, rights, responsibilities, you know, including the availability of language services, intake forms, information forms, and things such as instructions, medical discharge summaries, public safety information, general government communication, public notices, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what, you know, we talked about before, there being a big difference between, you know, translating a permission slip or a permission form, or translating, you know, medication instructions, and how there's that like spectrum of consequences for that. So you really want to make sure that you are ready to have your vital documentation translated ahead of time, and you want to be able to define that in your language access plan. Most sections of your organization's documents are going to need to be translated professionally. It's also pretty critical to make sure that once those documents are translated, that the content is conceptually, linguistically, and culturally accurate, right? And that's why it's so crucial to work directly with the communities served to ensure that your translations are culturally relevant. So another thing to consider is which modalities of translation and interpretation you're committed to providing, right? Are you going to do phone, video, in-person, simultaneous, consecutive, liaison, sight translation? I'm sorry, not right now, kiddo. I forgot to lock the door, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, so getting to know the services, understanding the modalities of the interpretation and the translation that you're going to provide, committing to providing them, and writing it down in your language access plan are important, because then you're going to have a framework from which to source all of those different services, right? So if you have it outlined in a plan that you are going to offer telephonic interpretation to your clients, then you know, it will follow that you make sure you have a contract with an OPI or over the phone interpretation service provider, right? So it really helps to actually define these things so that you're prepared, going back to this proactive versus reactive stance. And then, you know, the final part that we're going to talk about today is providing notice, right? This is part of your language access plan. You know, once you've decided which services you're willing, obligated, or happy to provide for English learners, you have to let those English learners know, right? So posting notices about the availability of language assistance services is an effective way to ensure that English learners can like meaningfully access your programs and your services. Right, so meaningful access talks about, you know, having the same level of access as a native English speaker would have, for English learning individuals. It's really helpful to post notices like in reception areas and other areas where the staff interact with the public. So maybe your organization could consider posting notices on its website, at entrances to brick and mortar locations, in exam rooms, if you're in a hospital, or any other location where English learners might interact directly with your organization and need assistance. So here are some common forms of notice that you can use. Most of these are pretty easy to do, and even just taking those small steps makes a big difference, right? So again, while having I Speak cards, written notices, audio-visual mediums, taglines, social media posts, it's not going to solve your language access problem, but it will show respect for the English learners in your community. It will elevate the engagement level between English learners in your community and your organization. And it's a place to start that is rooted in showing people that they matter and that their voice is welcome, right? So one of these are I Speak cards, which are over here on the right. That's just an example of, basically a card that can help you identify what language an individual speaks, right? And also to identify, what language an interpreter will need to speak to communicate effectively with that individual. I Speak cards are also called language ID cards, and they can contain text kind of like, I speak Spanish, and I will need an interpreter today. In a variety of different languages. I know hospitals, or at least some of the hospitals that I work with, have a bunch of these pre-printed in tons of different languages that they actually distribute to patients whenever patients come in, and they can be reused. And some of them have them non-branded so that the patients can also use them in other situations. And it's a card that, maybe you provide to somebody, but that person can keep it in their wallet and use it for all sorts of different situations. So they can be really helpful. And they're intended to help an individual sort of be able to show you the language that he or she understands. Organizations, can create their own versions of the I Speak card, or there are tons of them online that are like for public use. LEP.gov has some, and they're really easy to produce. It's a really good way to get a lot of like bang for your buck, so to speak. And I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with these, but when you really put them into practice well, they can be quite effective. Individual notices. Your organization could provide notice to English learners, in their own language that an interpreter will be provided at no cost to them, right? And it's kind of similar to the I Speak cards in that, these notices can kind of contain a statement in English and a different language to allow English learners to point to the language they speak, and that will help your organization identify an interpreter who also speaks that language. Taglines are another great way to provide notice. You can print these on your electronic materials. So like on your website, for example, they're designed to inform English learners about the availability of language assistance services. So for like a Spanish speaking one, it might say, on your website, if you speak Spanish, language assistance services are available free of charge. Call, 1-800-TRANSLATE for assistance. The Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights has a bunch of sample notices and taglines and a whole bunch of different languages that you can use. Another one is, language identification charts, such as the one on the left here. This one was produced by the Allegheny County Department of Human Services, which is my county where I live. Just hanging one of these in your brick and mortar locations. It's another example of a way that people can feel welcome and have the opportunity to just point at a language they speak. And these are really great because even in instances of low literacy, many times individuals will be able to recognize their language at least. So, having the visual representation of their language with the font and the different accents and things like that can help people who aren't able to maybe read an I Speak card as easily to be able to just, come in, let's say to an emergency room or to traffic court or to some branch of city government and, point to their language and then wait, and they'll get an interpreter on the phone, hopefully, if you guys write that into your plans and are successful in getting the different branches of your governments or organizations to follow through. So, you know, this is not an exhaustive list, and this is definitely not like A to Z for language access planning, but I hope it can kind of get your gears turning and give you a place to start. I'm really looking forward to continuing this topic next week, because I think it's a great one to kind of take all of the ideas and practical skills and resources we've been sharing and put them to use and start kind of defining, you know, how to move forward once this series is over. In the meantime, I want to be mindful of your time and leave the rest of today's session for discussion, questions, or anything else you'd like to bring up. If you have experience with language access planning, I would really love for you to share your input with the group, simply because, you know, there's no one size fits all for this, but the experiences that we all can share with each other might really resonate with somebody else and kind of be very helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of the screen sharing mode, and we can all have a chat and tell me about your language access planning experience, and or ask me questions or ask each other questions.
Hi, my name is Zaira. I'm from the city of Lancaster.
Hi, Sarah.
And hi, I am so happy to be in these workshops. I am so thankful for you and for your time. It is so helpful.
Thank you.
Some areas I have targeted, and others is like, oh, I need to do this. Oh, I need to do that. And so I am at we are at the point of we're launching Language Line, vital document translation, and we're doing that within the next 2 weeks. So I am under a lot of pressure right now, and all this information is so valuable to me in such a crucial time where there's protest nationally, and you know, some governmental agencies in the country are taking severe measures, others are taking proactive measures. We are here, our city has not been vandalized. There's protest, and we've been at the edge of having a riot, but we have not had them. Thankfully, you know, thanking all the city leadership, and now, you know, showing all of our constituents all the work and launching this language access. And something that we did to address the needs, or not the needs, to identify the needs and the community that needs it, is we designed an electronic survey through SurveyMonkey, and that's the way we interviewed all city management staff pertaining the language needs, the encounters, the points of encounters, perhaps the amount of times for encounters with the LEP community. So we identified that Spanish, of course, is the biggest need that we have in our community. The question that I have for you perhaps is how to advocate to perhaps service LEP communities that are less than the 5% of the recommended HUD threshold line, especially with the emerging COVID-19 virus, where I personally feel, okay, so I can understand perhaps, you know, limiting certain things because perhaps there's not enough demand of a specific language. But with regards to health, or like a health crisis, the one that our nation and the world has been facing, I personally feel that everyone should have equal access to the information. And I feel that, how do you leverage management to support a cause like this? Because of course, the first thing that they're looking at is resources. And all cities have been affected heavily in that specific area.
Absolutely. I saw
So what would you say?
Yeah, I saw Karen's hand kind of go up, and I know that she's dealing with a lot of this, so she may have some insight for you. And then I also have some comments. But Karen, what it looks
Yeah,
like?
so, and this is also going to be a suggestion because I saw this in the chat box too. Someone's about reaching out to refugee or settlement agencies. So what we did here, because I work for the state of Michigan, and we kind of had this issue when we were trying to decide what languages to do translations for COVID documents. And I think I've said this previously, so I apologize to some of those who might have heard this already, but we have 3 state ethnic commissions, and they do obviously happen to coincide with some of our larger ethnic communities. So we have a Hispanic Latino commission, a Middle Eastern American commission, and an Asian Pacific American. So we are translating into Spanish, Arabic, and simplified Chinese. But then we also, Zara, to your point, really we're trying to be thoughtful about in particular, our recent refugee arrivals over the last 3 to 5 years, and they would not necessarily meet that 5% threshold, but we still, again, thought that was a really important group to also be represented in our language and our translations. So our state refugee coordinator, I oversee that program, and so in the coordinator, so I reached out to our state refugee coordinator and asked him to provide me with the languages for the most recent arrivals in our state over the last 3 to 5 years. So, I would even say those of you on the phone, I know there was a suggestion in the chat box about going to refugee or settlement agencies, but you could even just go directly to your state refugee coordinator's office and ask for them to provide you with that information. They'd have the data readily available and easily available. And that way, if you have resettlement agencies, I know that we do here in Michigan, we have some that cover similar geographic areas. In that way, you won't have to go to multiple resettlement agencies to find out that information.
Yeah.
So
ahead,
just to that, yes, we do work with some, actually the local resettlement agencies, such as Church World Service and others. And they were the ones primarily providing the communication, but it was not something that perhaps we weren't supplementing. They were doing that themselves. I experienced perhaps social media was being translated, and this is another question I have. What are the in meaningful access? And all the questions that have been arising about the use of Google Translate. What would be our requirement or commitment with regards to social media communication? So if we are communicating to the community via social media and providing perhaps biased information in social posts and trying to get the community to understand the seriousness via social posting. We were translating most of these posts in Spanish, but no other language. I was not allowed to conduct translations into any other language, specifically because the demand was very low and it is very underrepresented groups. And so I just did not feel satisfied, and I would like to know how to leverage or break that type of a barrier, because I feel that, just like you said, they are a little less represented, but they're equally important.
Yeah, and my answer is that, like, even having one person, right, who access, to me, would qualify to have in language communication, but that is always kind of balanced against the resources that are available. So you could appeal to we could get sued, right? You could talk to leaders and decision makers about the reasons why their expenses might be higher in the long run if they don't do this. And you can also look at the law. So the law says 5%, right? But there's some ambiguity there in that it also could be like the equivalent in need, like any significant population, at least with regard to Title VI, there's some wiggle room there because it's such a sort of subjective law where really it's a case-by-case basis. And just because it's not spelled out that you have to only provide language access for, a population group that reaches 5%, that doesn't mean that there's no responsibility there, because in a lot of cities like Pittsburgh, where I live, for example, you know, there's no way, even our biggest language groups, like Spanish speakers, they're not even close to 5% of the total population of our county, right? But they're, you know, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of people who are Spanish speaking, and about 30% of those are English proficient, right? So how do you make the case that that group, it's not 5% of the total population, but you know, it's equivalent in need? And I think the answer is that there is no answer, but you can definitely demonstrate, you know, the kind of thing where, just like it costs a lot more money for people to show up at the ER than it does for them to get preventative care, you know, in the long run, the health and well-being of your entire region is going to be, you know, have poorer outcomes if people are excluded, if people aren't taking advantage of public safety, if people aren't understanding social distancing measures, right? Like, that's dangerous for everybody, right? So it's not necessarily a matter of what the law says, but what's best for everyone. And balancing that against the expense is like one of the ongoing challenges, because there's no right answer. Karen, do you have something to add?
Oh, no, I was gonna ask a different question, sorry.
Oh, sure.
Can I add something real quick?
Yeah.
This is Uma.
Please.
So I am with the city of Austin, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways that we are trying to cover as many languages as possible, while also looking at that 5% threshold, it's basically to go by district. We have different districts in the city, 10 total. If we go by a total number of the population in Austin, we will only serve Spanish speakers. But if you go in District 4, for example, you have more Arabic speakers in that district than Spanish speakers. So for me, when I go and train departments, and by the way, we do our language access plan by department based on what they are providing in the community. And I tell them to look at where, for example, they are going to hold a community meeting. Look at that district, look at your location, what are the languages in that location, what are the most spoken languages, and you start translating your flyers and your documents and the most critical things that you need in that area. That's how we have been navigating the serving as many languages as possible.
That's a really good point that I had never considered before, is what's your metric, right? If you're looking at it by county, like you said, it might just be Spanish speakers, but if you break it down by ward or district, you might get different numbers. And I think that's a really good strategy.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Do we have any, oh, Karen.
So I know there was a few of us talking about this in the chat box. I'd be curious, Mary Jane, to hear if you have any thoughts, or anyone else on the call if you didn't see it in the chat. But a number of us have talked about the challenges of, once you translate a document, having the owner of that document let you know if it's been updated. And I know that's a huge issue that we have as well. So I don't know if there's any suggestion. I mean, we've talked about, again, in the chat, there was talk about, you know, using some type of a document bank or what have you. But I don't know, we've reached out to even the document owners and have said, please send us this one that's updated, and we don't get it. So
yeah, so that's a really good point. And I think there are two different pieces of it. One is, like you said, getting the updated information can be a struggle. And also even like having the bandwidth to track all of that, right? Like, how are you going to track all of the documents that you've ever had translated, where they came from, and whether they've been updated? I mean, that's just a huge undertaking. And so, you know, I think the strategy for dealing like that will vary from, you know, organization to organization, department to department. And I don't say that to deflect the question, just that, you know, a good example would be the Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh. They source a lot of their information from a very similar source. and there's one person who maintains that relationship and processes all of the translations. And so, you know, when we talk about assigning specific roles to people in your language access plan and specific responsibilities, and then evaluating every year, we didn't get into evaluation yet, but we'll talk about that next week. I think it's important to have some mechanism in place where maybe quarterly, it would be reasonable to look at all of the vital documents that you've had translated and go back and update them. I think it would be impossible to do this for every document you've ever translated, but definitely for your vital documents, I think it's important, anything health and safety related. And then in the case of COVID-19, I mean, the information changes all the time, but that kind of brings me to the second piece of that, of my answer to that, which is the cost is also a problem. You don't want to have to retranslate an entire document every single time something changes when 90% of the document won't need to be retranslated, right? So make sure that your translation agency is willing to only bill you for what those changes are, or that they're using computer-assisted translation tools that will automatically factor in previously translated content, you know, when determining the word count to bill you for, and things like that. So I would, you know, break it down into those two different pieces, but you know, that's one of those, I mean, language access is just so complex, right? And because there's no agreed upon best practice for things like that, it's hard to answer that question. And it's even harder to put it in practice when you're trying to kind of herd cats in terms of all the different information that you have. So that's kind of the best I can do on that question for now, but I think it's a good one. And I think it's worth doing a deeper dive into.
This is Jody. I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm the language access coordinator for the city. And just in response to that, I think you did a really good job. I think you've identified the important pieces. What Uma said, and that's just basically following up with the liaisons, making sure that they stay on top of it. I think some of that is really exhausting work, but I think that's where I've had the most success. If they care, and if they start to develop their language access antenna a little bit better, they're more likely to follow up with things. Part of my challenge is that the way our language access plan is structured, each department is responsible to fund their own services. There is no centralized budget.
Yeah.
In theory, it sounds great, but the problem with that is that leaves a lot of that leaves department directors a lot of freedom to decide how they think it needs to happen. And if they're not informed about needs, you know, in some cases, if there is any type of bias, it can be really challenging to make sure that they're compliant. But there's a little bit of tension if they're the ones that are creating and maintaining the documents. You know, who am I from a different department to come in and ask you to do something a little different? So I think it's just one of those structural things we're gonna have to sort through in the coming years. But yeah, that's been one of my biggest challenges. I did try to use a shared folder model, but it really is only as good as people use it.
Yeah, and I love what you said about developing a language access radar. That's awesome. I'm gonna probably use that. I'll give you credit when I do.
With permission. No, go ahead. You can use it.
Thank you. Well, I do want to be mindful of everybody's time, and we are right on track. It's 4 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and end today's call, but thank you guys so much. I'm really enjoying these sessions. I want to reiterate again, up at the top of the chat are the links for the one-on-one coaching sessions and also for the survey to give us your feedback on these so that we can make sure the second half of the program is what you're looking for and what you want. And next week, we will continue to talk about language access planning with evaluation and lots of other fun stuff. So thank you. Have a good week, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon.
Thank you.
All right, bye everyone.